All right.
What was your record?
Yeah, not quite. I don't know. I thought it was funny, but maybe inappropriate. I don't know.
Whoa, wait.
Sorry.
That's too much.
Sorry, too much?
Yeah.
I'm sure just forget you ever saw it. This one actually is funnier, but you got to sort of know it.
You're bad.
All right, so we are talking about excretion, the removal of waste, metabolic waste from an organism. And so we're going to do what we've been doing, talk about how this compares between different types of organisms, compare simple animals, more complex animals, and just sort of talk about overall, we'll talk more about human excretion than some of the others. So excretion is necessary for all organisms. All organisms in their normal metabolic processes produce some waste products that have to be eliminated because if they were to build up, they would become toxic or dangerous to the organism. So when we talk about excretion, we're talking about the removal of cellular waste, metabolic waste. And so those waste products, we talked about them just a minute ago. Nitrogenous waste, waste that contain nitrogen. This is one of the biggest categories. Salts, carbon dioxide, excess water. These are all things that can only be tolerated within a limited range inside of living organisms. And so organisms have a variety of adaptations for maintaining homeostasis in terms of these materials. So nitrogenous waste, this is one of the important categories. So what nutrient that organisms use contains nitrogen? Think back to biochemistry. We think about the chemical formula of the different groups of molecules. Proteins. So carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Fats have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Proteins, however, also have a significant amount of nitrogen in them. And so the nitrogen waste that living organisms need to get rid of typically comes from the breakdown of proteins. When proteins are used for energy, so if you think back to some of what we talked about, what's the primary, easiest source of energy for most organisms? Which group of molecules? Carbohydrates. What's usually next? Fats. And then proteins are sort of third. Usually, for example, in humans, our body won't use much protein as a source of energy unless necessary. When we do break down proteins for other organisms, part of that breakdown process means the nitrogen has to be dealt with. That process is called deamination. So when proteins get broken down to amino acids, the amino group from those amino acids needs to be stripped off. Okay? That's deamination. And then something has to be done with it. And different organisms have different means of dealing with that nitrogen. And that's what this table indicates. So some organisms take that nitrogen, transform it into ammonia, NH3. Ammonia, however, is very toxic to the organism. So it has to be eliminated pretty quickly. And to eliminate it, it requires a large amount of water. And so the organisms that typically turn the nitrogen into ammonia and excrete it are organisms where they have plenty of water. So things that live in the water, protists, invertebrates, most aquatic organisms, because a lack of water is not an issue, they generally get rid of the nitrogen through releasing ammonia. Other organisms transform that ammonia into urea. Urea is a less toxic substance. Okay? It requires less water for removal. You need to make this change. It's wrong on what you have. So removing urea still takes water, but less water than ammonia. Organisms that remove the nitrogen in the form of urea, mammals, adult amphibians, earthworms, and some other land animals. The third way that some organisms get rid of this nitrogen waste is by transforming into uric acid. Uric acid is the least toxic. However, it's not soluble in water, so it can't be removed like in urine. These organisms typically move this uric acid into their feces and then excrete it from there. So think about birds. Okay? Birds don't urinate, right? You don't ever get peed on by a bird because their nitrogen wastes are mixed in with feces, and that white stuff you see when a bird pooped on your parents' car, that's part of that uric acid. It's also one of the reasons why it can damage the paint of the car if you leave it on there too long. So you might have heard your parents talk about that. Generally, uric acid is moved into the feces for elimination. However, humans do eliminate some uric acid. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so let's compare our organisms that we've been talking about all along. So protists, bacteria, hydra, aquatic organisms, single-celled organisms, they have a pretty easy time to deal with this. Basically, ammonia just diffuses out of the cell through the cell membrane. Simple. Plants typically can recycle nitrogen waste products. Animals, however, usually need to deal with it in some way through excretion. So the earthworm. Here we have the earthworm, and this is the grasshopper. So the earthworm have structures called nephridia. And these nephridia are sort of like small kidneys almost. They absorb ammonia and urea. Okay? There's a pair of these nephridia in each segment of the worm. They draw in waste. Okay? And as that waste moves through, the earthworm can reabsorb any useful material, and that excess is eliminated. Grasshoppers, okay, they have a structure called Malpighian tubules. Basically, you can see in the diagram here, they take the waste products from the body tissue, absorb it, send it then into the feces in the intestine, and then it gets eliminated through the feces. So that's another means of dealing with it. Humans get rid of their metabolic waste in a few different ways. So our lungs are, besides taking in oxygen, obviously our lungs excrete carbon dioxide, but also water. As our blood vessels, capillaries, surround the alveoli of our lungs, those air sacs, carbon dioxide and water diffuse into that air, and then we exhale it. So our lungs are an excretory organ. Sweat glands. Sweat glands are in our skin. This diagram of a cross-section of skin here, you have a sweat gland connected to the surface. And sweat gland, the main function of sweat is for cooling, to maintain body temperature. As we sweat, and that sweat evaporates from our skin, it cools us down. However, sweat is not just water, it has other material in it as well. 98% of sweat is water, but then 2% are waste products that our sweat glands help us to excrete. So 2% is urea and salts. Urea, the same waste that's in urine, is actually in our sweat. And so if you have been outside exercising for a long time, it's hot out and the sweat evaporates from your skin, what's left on your skin, sort of white, crusty, salty substance, is basically that urea and a mixture of salts that's left over after the water part evaporates. Or like you wear the same baseball hat every day and you get sweaty, It forms sort of white, crusty stuff on the inside. That crusty stuff is urea, basically, and salts. And then the liver. The liver is an important organ for many different reasons, but it fulfills some excretory functions. The liver is where the amino acids are actually deaminated, where the amino group is stripped off and dealt with. So the liver removes that nitrogen and produces urea. It transforms that nitrogen into a less harmful source. It also detoxifies our blood coming from the small intestine. It removes things, it breaks down, metabolizes alcohol. Okay? Toxins are broken down in the liver. As you know from Frank's case study, the liver helps to recycle red blood cells, producing bile. It also helps inactivate hormones, okay, that have sort of done their function. So the liver does several important things. But we're going to spend most of our time talking about the kidneys. The kidneys are key excretory organ in the human body. And the kidneys are responsible for removing most nitrogen waste and maintaining the proper levels of a bunch of other things. Water, glucose, salts, ions. These are regulated. The level of these materials is regulated by the kidneys. They're shaped like a bean. They're larger than a bean. They actually look just like a kidney bean. That's why a kidney bean is called that, because it's the exact shape and color of an actual kidney. This is what they look like. They're located in your lower back on each side of your vertebrae. It's why, like in boxing, it's illegal to punch somebody in the lower back, because they're fairly close to the surface. They can be damaged by that physical trauma. And a kidney actually is composed of millions of individual units that are called nephrons. Each nephron helps to filter out certain substances from the blood. So if we look at this sort of overall diagram of the urinary system, so two kidneys, we all have two kidneys, a right and a left kidney. They're supplied with blood through major arteries, and all the blood in your circulation has to go through those kidneys at some point. And as the blood goes through the kidneys, then various materials are filtered out. Each kidney connects to the bladder by the ureter, the long tube, and the kidneys take all these waste products, mix them with water to form urine, and there's a constant drip of urine from the kidneys into the bladder. As that bladder sort of fills up, there are nerves that tell our brain when our bladder is full, when we need to find a bathroom. And there are nerves which then open up, okay, the bladder. The final passageway for urine out of the body is through the urethra, and that's sort of the overall picture of the urinary system. So what's actually going on inside of those kidneys? How do they actually remove these waste products? Well, they do it through these collection of millions of individual units called a nephron. We'll talk a little bit about this. We won't get into, you won't need to memorize all the details, but it's important to understand how the kidneys work. So first of all, they have a supply of blood to the kidneys. Blood in our arteries is under high pressure. And so as the blood is forced into this sort of round collection of blood vessels called the glomerulus, that high pressure forces some of the plasma out of our blood and into this yellow colored tube here. That's the actual nephron. And so that fluid that's forced into the nephron contains lots of different things. It contains water, contains salts, uric acid, urea, glucose, all these different materials. And that's then called filtrate. And that filtrate travels through this tube, loops up and around, and along the way, our blood can reabsorb certain substances that would be useful to us. And that process sort of happens by that filtrate moving down through this lower loop. So it loops around, it's called the loop of Henle, comes back up, it winds around, these are called convoluted tubules, and then eventually, once that material reaches this collecting duct, then it's urine. And each of these little branches would be connected to a different nephron, like millions of them. And so, if we look at what's going on, here's the individual nephron, this long tube. The filtrate gets forced out here in the Bowman's capsule, and then different materials are moving into and out of our blood to form eventually the urine at this collecting tubule. If we think about what urine is, basically 95% water, 2% is urea, and then a bunch of other substances in much smaller quantities. And these levels will fluctuate. If a person is consuming a lot of protein, for example, one popular, so sort of diets go in phases. You know, sometimes people go on low-fat diets, low-carb diets, low-protein diets. One that's popular now, and you may have heard, is like a keto diet. And this is like a high protein. When a person's trying to lose weight, the high protein foods, they try to limit their carbohydrates. Well, one of the things that happens is that increasing the amount of proteins a person's consuming increases the amount of nitrogen that their excretory system has to deal with. So sometimes people that are having kidney trouble are put on low protein diets. Sometimes an extended high protein diet can be taxing on the kidneys. And so that's because the kidneys are being forced to deal with all this nitrogenous waste. So what are some malfunctions? What are some diseases that can happen related to the kidneys and the excretory system? Well, kidney disease is kind of like this general term. Kidney disease can be caused by many different factors, and we'll talk about some of those. And when our kidneys don't work properly, that can be a dangerous situation. Urea can build up, salts and water can accumulate in the blood. The term for that is uremia, which means basically the things that should be in our urine are actually staying in our blood and causing problems. So our kidney function can be affected if a person has low blood pressure. Not enough of that filtrate is actually forced into the nephron, and therefore it can't filter things efficiently. High blood pressure can also be a problem because as blood pressure increases, the nephron can be damaged. There can be damage to the nephrons due to things like high blood pressure, drugs, lead, mercury, toxins, infections, blockages, physical trauma to the kidneys. All these things can interfere with the functioning of the nephron and therefore excretion of material. Anyone ever heard of kidney stones? So kidney stone is a crystal in different parts of our body, gallstones, kidney stones, form when minerals that are meant to be excreted sometimes crystallize and form little, not stones, but little crystals that then are eliminated from the body. Now this is a really big kidney stone, so that's almost a centimeter big. So if you ever known someone that had kidney stones, so you probably know that they're extremely painful because as these minerals build up, they have to be eliminated. If we go back here and look at the urinary system, kidney stones that are formed in the kidneys, they have to travel then through this pretty narrow tube, the ureter. They end up in the bladder, and eventually they are eliminated through the urethra. So a large kidney stone going through relatively narrow tubes causes a lot of pain. And so the larger the stones, the more that there are, the more painful it might be. There's not really great treatments. They don't do like surgery or anything to remove them. Sometimes they try to break them up using sound waves. It's not all that effective. Most of the time, they encourage a person to drink lots of water, to increase the flow of urine and try to flush out those kidney stones, but usually just have to wait until they pass, and then usually a person's pretty relieved once that happens. Another disease you might hear of is gout. Gout is when uric acid that should be eliminated by the kidneys is not. It's built up to too high levels, and it gets deposited in a person's joints as these crystals of uric acid. Sometimes it used to be called the king's disease because it was common in people eating lots of shellfish and meat and alcohol can encourage the development of gout. So when a person does have kidney failure, it's something that needs to be treated. So a person can live and be perfectly healthy with a single functioning kidney. So if a person had some trauma, a car accident or something, and one of their kidneys were damaged and wasn't working, they can live fine with just one single kidney working. One kidney can do all the job of filtration, no problem. However, if a person has two kidneys that are failing, two kidneys that are not excreting waste properly, that's a problem. So has anyone heard of a treatment for, so what is if you have two kidneys that are not functioning, what can be done to help? Is that?
Transplant.
So yeah, really, if those kidney disease typically is not something that improves much. So if a person's kidneys are damaged or not working, really one of the main treatments is a kidney transplant. So where would a person get it? How could a person get a kidney to transplant into their body? Good?
Find a donor that has a match.
Yeah, so people donate organs. So there's a couple ways that this happens. Sometimes a person is an organ donor in that they marked a little box on their driver's license that says, if I pass away, the doctors have permission to use organs from my body that are still healthy, they're still functioning, and be given to people that are in need of those organs. So a kidney is one of those organs that's commonly transplanted. The other way it happens is a relative oftentimes can donate one of their healthy kidneys to somebody in their family, typically that's in need. Because if I have two healthy kidneys, and someone in my family has no healthy kidneys, the doctors can take one of my kidneys, transplant it into that other person. I can live fine because I have one healthy kidney and do the job. And then my relative can also be healthy and live fine because they have now one of my functioning kidneys. So kidney transplants are fairly common. However, usually with most organ donation, there are many more people that need an organ donated than actually there are organs to give them. So there are lists and there are ways of determining who's going to get an organ and so forth. In the meantime, while they're waiting, a person whose kidneys are not working, you can't survive without working kidneys. So there is a treatment that they go for called dialysis. You may have heard about dialysis treatment. In dialysis treatment, basically they have an artificial machine. It acts almost as if it were a kidney. So a person would have to visit, so some versions you can do at home. Sometimes you visit a special office. Sometimes you go to the hospital. And basically, there's a couple ways to do it, but the main way is that they take blood from a vein, they run it through this dialysis machine, which eliminates and helps filter out the things your kidneys should be filtering out, and then that blood is put back into your body, but it's been filtered. Depending on how extreme the kidney disease is and so forth, you might have to go every day or every couple days. Just sort of depends on the situation. And that can keep a person alive and somewhat healthy until they can receive a transplant. Really, the transplant is the ultimate cure for this. So they can be on dialysis until that's able to happen. So if you remember, we use dialysis tubing in our labs. That's actually, they do use that in the dialysis machine because it's a semi-permeable membrane. It's used to help filter out some of these materials from the person's body.
So sometimes I hear about like people running out of spots to like have dialysis done. How come you can't reuse the same spot?
Well, so typically, like a person's going to be on extended dialysis. What they do is they put a port in, like a permanent sort of. And if you ever had an IV, they just take a needle and they find a vein and they stick it in, right? So they can do that. But if a person's going to need repeated IVs or repeatedly get blood transfusions, go through dialysis, they install a permanent little device, often in somebody's neck, that they just, it's like, they just plug in the machine there. It's like a quick release thing. They plug in the machine and then they have easy, they don't have to do another, another needle. So it's just sort of a permanent port. And sometimes, veins and areas to put in these ports, sometimes the veins collapse and you have to find another area, and sometimes it's difficult. Often people that have these diseases might also have other problems that make it more difficult to find those spots. All right, and to finish up, a couple other excretory malfunctions, urinary tract infections. You may have heard of this, sometimes called UTIs. So a urinary tract infection is when bacteria have made their way into the urinary system and it's caused an infection, just like an ear infection or a strep throat, but it's an infection in the urinary system somewhere. Could be in the bladder, could be in the ureter. If it spreads into the kidneys, then it can damage them. So it's something that needs to be treated. Typically a person might hurt when they urinate, and that might be the signs that they might go get checked out for a urinary tract infection. And they're much more common in women than they are in men. And that's because of the length of the urethra. So men, the urethra is longer, so it's more difficult for bacteria to make their way into the bladder. Anatomically in women, the urethra is shorter, and it's easier for bacteria to get into the bladder because they have less distance to travel. And usually it's treated with just like antibiotics, oral antibiotics, something like that. Finally, liver failure. The liver, as we talked about, important part of the excretory system. If it is breaking down, if it's not functioning properly, it needs to be treated. You can't live without a liver. Things that cause it, infection, especially things like hepatitis, can damage the liver. Cancer can damage the liver. Alcoholism can lead to liver cirrhosis because the liver is the organ that detoxifies alcohol. And so if a person is continually exposing the liver to high levels of alcohol, it starts to damage it, and eventually it breaks down. And that's called cirrhosis of the liver. Symptoms include things like jaundice. You remember when we did the case study? Frank had jaundice, and some of you were not sure, or some of you said when you were a baby you had jaundice. Again, that's the buildup of this material, bilirubin, and it leads to discoloration of the skin and the eyes. In this picture, you can see this person, the whites of their eyes are kind of like yellowy color, and that's due to the buildup of those materials, that bilirubin in the white of the eye. All right. Any questions about anything related to excretory system? So